Have you ever felt that sensation? That inexplicable feeling that someone is watching you from just beyond your peripheral vision? That peculiar weight in the air when you're alone in an unfamiliar place? I never used to believe in those feelings, until what happened at Blackwood Pines. This isn't just another creepy cabin story. This is about real people who vanished without explanation, leaving behind only whispers and questions that haunt the forests of northern Maine to this day. If you've ever stood at the edge of a vast wilderness as darkness falls, you know that primal fear I'm talking about. The kind that makes your skin prickle, makes you question what might be lurking just beyond the tree line. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some mysteries are better left unsolved, and why sometimes the forest keeps its secrets for a reason. Before I continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy unsolved mysteries and spine-tingling tales that blur the line between fact and folklore. Share your own unexplained experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, let me take you to Blackwood Pines where our story begins. The first time I saw the Blackwood cabin, I immediately understood why my college friend Derek was so excited about it. "Isn't it perfect?" he said, practically bouncing as we pulled up the gravel driveway. My uncle practically gave it away. It was October 2018, and the Maine wilderness looked like it was on fire with autumn colors. The cabin itself was rustic but charming. Dark timber walls weathered by decades of harsh winters, a stone chimney climbing up one side, and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. "How far are the neighbors?" I asked, noticing nothing but forest in every direction. Derek grinned. "That's the best part, Alex. There aren't any, not for miles." Our friends Mia and Jason pulled up behind us in their SUV, loaded with enough food and drinks for our 4-day weekend getaway. Mia, a photography major, immediately started capturing the scenic views, while Jason joked that the place looked straight out of a horror movie. That first evening was perfect. We grilled burgers on the deck, drank beer, and told stories as the sun set behind the mountains. The forest came alive with night sounds, crickets, an owl's call, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "So what's the story with this place?" Jason asked as we sat around the fire pit. "Every cabin this old has some kind of history." Derek took a long sip of his beer. "Funny you should ask. The previous owners just disappeared about 30 years ago. Left everything behind: clothes, car, food on the table. Search parties combed these woods for weeks, but never found a trace." "You're making that up," Mia said, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. "Swear to God." Derek raised his hand. "My uncle got it for a steal because nobody local would touch it. They call it the vanishing cabin around here." "Any theories about what happened?" I asked. "Official reports said they probably got lost hiking, but my uncle said the locals have other ideas. Something about voices in the trees. Lights where no lights should be." We all laughed, but it was the nervous kind of laughter that masks discomfort. As I was about to close the curtains in my bedroom that night, I noticed something strange. A faint light moving between the trees, like a flashlight bobbing in the darkness. "Derek," I called out. "Is there a trail back there? I think I see someone." He came to my room and peered out the window, but by then the light was gone. "Probably just a reflection," he said with a yawn. "There's no trail on this property, and the nearest one is miles away." My sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of walking through endless woods, following a light that always remained just out of reach. At one point, I jerked awake, convinced I'd heard someone whispering my name. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. Then I heard it, a soft scratching at my window. I froze, listening intently. The scratching stopped. When I checked the window the next morning, I noticed something unsettling. 3 distinct lines etched in the dirt on the outside of the glass, too uniform to be made by anything natural. I didn't mention it to the others, but that was just the beginning. first small warning that Blackwood Pines was not as empty as it appeared. The next day dawned bright and crisp. After breakfast, Mia suggested we explore the property. "Derek, does this place have a trail map or something?" she asked, slinging her camera around her neck. "Not really. There's supposed to be an old shed somewhere out back, and a small creek to the east." We set out, the morning dew still clinging to the tall grass. The property was larger than it appeared, with the forest growing denser the further we walked from the cabin. The trees were old here, massive trunks with gnarled roots that reached across the forest floor like arthritic fingers. "It's so quiet," Jason remarked. "No birds." He was right. The forest had fallen strangely silent. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just our footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. About 20 minutes into our walk, we found the shed Derek had mentioned. It was barely standing, the roof partially collapsed, the walls leaning precariously. I noticed something strange, symbols carved into the wooden doorframe. Crude but deliberate markings that reminded me of the scratches on my window. Jason peered inside. "Whoa, there's still stuff in here." Despite its dilapidated state, we carefully entered. Unlike the cabin, this place looked like it had been abandoned mid-use decades ago. Rusty tools hung from nails. Mason jars filled with unidentifiable materials lined a shelf. "Look at this," Mia said, pointing to a workbench. On it lay an open journal, its pages yellow with age. Derek picked it up carefully. "October 17th, 1987. He read from the last entry. "The voices are getting louder. Sarah thinks it's just the wind, but I know better. Something is watching us from the trees. I've seen the lights again, moving in patterns that nothing natural would make. Tomorrow, we're hiking out to the old stone circle to investigate. If I'm right about what's happening here, we need to—" Derek stopped. "That's it?" Jason asked. "What happens next?" Derek turned the journal to show us the abrupt end of the entry, followed by blank pages. "That's all there is." "What's the date the previous owners disappeared?" I asked. Derek's face paled slightly. "October 18th, 1987. We all stood in silence, the implications hanging in the air. I flipped back through earlier entries in the journal. Most were mundane, notes about repairs to the cabin, wildlife sightings. But about 2 weeks before the final entry, the tone changed. The writer, someone named Thomas, began describing unusual occurrences. Unexplained lights in the forest, objects moving within the cabin, a persistent feeling of being watched. "We should head back," Derek said suddenly. "Wait," Mia said, taking pictures of the journal pages. "What if we try to find this stone circle?" "Bad idea," I said immediately, surprising myself with my vehemence. "Come on, Alex," Jason grinned. "Where's your sense of adventure? We've got a real-life mystery on our hands." I was outvoted. We carefully removed the journal from the shed and headed back to the cabin to search for mentions of the stone circle. Several entries referenced it, describing it as being near the lightning tree, where the creek bends north. Derek found a county survey map in a drawer. There's a creek about half a mile east of here. It makes a sharp turn around this area. By mid-afternoon, we'd packed day packs with water, snacks, and flashlights and were heading toward the creek. The walk took longer than expected. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Fallen trees blocked our path. Thorny bushes seemed to reach out like grasping hands. "Now, we need to find this lightning tree," Derek said, consulting the journal again. "Over here," Mia called. After about 20 minutes of searching, we converged on her position about 100 yards from the creek. She was standing before an enormous oak tree, its trunk split down the middle as if struck by lightning, the two halves growing in slightly different directions like a massive Y. We followed a natural path that led deeper into the woods. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out much of the fading sunlight. And then we saw it. A perfect circle of standing stones, each about waist high, arranged in a clearing. 12 stones in all, with a flat altar-like rock in the center. The stones were covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen on the shed door. "This isn't historic," Derek said, examining one of the stones. "These aren't weathered enough to be ancient." "Someone made this recently?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. Jason had approached the center stone and was running his hand along its flat surface. "Guys, there's something carved here, names and dates." We gathered around. Names had been carved into the stone, each with a date beside it. Some looked decades old, others more recent. "Thomas and Sarah Kendrick, October 18th, 1987. I read aloud, my finger tracing the names of the missing cabin owners. "There are more," Derek said grimly. "A lot more." We counted 26 names in all, spanning from 1953 to 2013. 26 people, all with the same fate recorded in the same 2 words carved beneath their names: the forest. "This is some Blair Witch stuff right here," Jason muttered. "We need to go," I said, as the last light began to fade from the sky. "Now." No one argued. We turned to leave, but something stopped me, a sound so faint I wasn't sure I'd actually heard it. A whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Alex!" I spun around. "Did you hear that?" The others looked at me blankly. "Hear what?" Mia asked. Someone whispered my name. As we stood there, the air grew suddenly, unnaturally cold. Our breath fogged in front of our faces. Then, one by one, we saw them. Faint, shimmering lights moving between the trees beyond the stone circle. Not flashlights or lanterns, but ghostly blue orbs that pulsed with their own inner light. "What the hell is that?" Jason whispered. The lights began to move in a pattern, circling the clearing, always keeping just within the tree line. And with them came the whispers, indistinct at first, then growing clearer. "Join us. Stay. The forest waits. Run!" Derek shouted. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, no longer caring about following the path. Behind us, the lights pursued, moving with impossible speed through the trees. The forest seemed to come alive around us. Branches reached down to snag our clothing, roots rose up to trip our feet. The whispers grew louder, calling each of our names in turn. I looked back once. A mistake. One of the lights was directly behind me, so close I could almost feel its cold energy on my neck. Within its bluish glow I caught a glimpse of a face, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Somehow, we made it back to the cabin as full darkness descended. We burst through the door, slamming and locking it behind us. Derek immediately began closing all the shutters, while Jason checked that the doors were secure. "What the hell was that?" Mia gasped, trying to catch her breath. No one had an answer. We moved through the cabin, turning on every light, as if brightness could somehow protect us. "We need to leave," I said. "First thing in the morning, we're out of here." "Why wait until morning?" Jason asked. "Let's go now." Derek looked out the front window cautiously. "It's pitch black out there, and the road down the mountain is treacherous even in daylight. We're safer waiting until morning." We gathered in the living room, none of us willing to be alone. Derek built a fire in the fireplace, more for comfort than warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, which now seemed ominous rather than cozy. "The journal," Mia said suddenly. "Where's the journal?" We looked around. In our panic to get back to the cabin, no one had thought to grab it from where we'd left it on the center stone. "I'm calling the Rangers," Jason decided, pulling out his cell phone. "No signal. Anyone else have reception?" We all checked our phones. Nothing. Not even a single bar. "The landline," Derek suggested, moving to the old rotary phone on the kitchen wall. He lifted the receiver, listened, then slowly set it back down. Dead. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning around the eaves of the cabin like a living thing. Or was it the wind? After what we'd heard in the forest, I wasn't sure I could trust my senses anymore. We decided to take shifts, staying awake through the night. Derek took the first watch while the rest of us tried to rest. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events at the stone circle in my mind. I must have drifted off because suddenly Derek was shaking me urgently. "Alex, wake up," he whispered. "They're here." I sat up, instantly alert. "The lights?" He nodded, leading me to the window. Carefully lifting one slat of the blinds, he pointed into the darkness. There they were, the same ghostly blue orbs, hovering at the edge of the forest, just beyond the cleared area surrounding the cabin. "Have they tried to come closer?" I asked. "No, they just watch. Been there for about an hour now." We woke Mia and Jason, who joined us at the windows. As if responding to our attention, the whispers started again, not in the forest this time, but seemingly inside the cabin itself, emanating from the very walls. "Join us. The forest waits. We've been so lonely." The temperature in the cabin plummeted. The lights outside began to move, drawing closer to the cabin in a slow, inexorable advance. I headed upstairs to check the small window in my bedroom. As I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the night breeze. I know I'd closed it. We'd checked all the windows earlier. Worst of all, one of the lights was directly outside, its eerie blue glow illuminating the room. And within that light, pressed against the glass, was a face I recognized from photographs downstairs. Thomas Kendrick, the missing owner from 1987. His features contorted in a silent plea. "Help us, Alex. We can't leave the forest." I finally found my voice and shouted for the others. Derek lunged forward, slamming the window shut just as the light was about to fully enter the room. "It knew my name," I said, shaking uncontrollably. "It had his face. Thomas Kendrick." Around 3 a.m., things escalated. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The lights pressed against every window simultaneously, their glow seeping through the smallest cracks in the shutters. The temperature dropped so low that ice began to form on the inside of the windows. And then the knocking started. Soft at first, then growing more insistent, rapping at the doors, the windows, the walls, even the roof. Not random pounding, but deliberate, rhythmic knocking, like some kind of code. Most disturbing of all, it sometimes synced perfectly with our heartbeats, as if whatever was out there could hear the blood pumping through our veins. "Make it stop," Mia sobbed, covering her ears. The fire in the fireplace suddenly extinguished itself, plunging us into darkness, broken only by the faint blue glow seeping through the cracks. "The generator," Derek said. "We need to get the lights back on." Derek and Jason took flashlights and headed to the basement door, while Mia and I huddled together on the couch. A few minutes later, the lights flickered back on. Relief washed over us, until we realized that Jason hadn't returned with Derek. "Jason?" Mia called down the basement stairs. "Derek?" Derek appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his face ashen. "He was right behind me. I swear he was right behind me. I turned around and he was gone." The basement behind Derek was a simple concrete room with a small window at ground level. A window that now stood open, cold night air streaming in. As we stood there, paralyzed with fear, a new sound came from outside. Jason's voice, distant and distorted. "Guys, help me. The forest, it has me." Mia ran for the front door, but Derek and I caught her. "You can't go out there," I said, holding her as she struggled. "That's what they want." "It's Jason," she screamed. "We have to help him." "That's not Jason anymore," Derek said grimly. "Listen." Jason's voice had changed, becoming a chorus of whispers. "Join us. The forest is waiting." so beautiful here, become part of it forever. Around 4 a.m., Mia suddenly sat upright, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "It's beautiful." Derek and I exchanged worried glances. We heard nothing but the constant knocking and whispering. "What do you hear, Mia?" I asked gently. "Music, the most beautiful music I've ever heard. Can't you hear it?" Her expression was rapturous, a smile spreading across her tear-stained face. She stood up, moving toward the front door with slow, dreamlike steps. "Mia, no!" Derek grabbed her arm, but she shook him off with surprising strength. "I have to go to it," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Jason is waiting. They're all waiting." I blocked the door. "Mia, there's no music. Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." Her smile faded, replaced by something cold and alien. "You're wrong, Alex. It's the only real thing. Everything else is the illusion. This life, this world. The forest shows the truth." Her eyes had changed. The warm brown had been replaced by a luminescent blue, the same color as the lights outside. Before we could act, Mia let out an inhuman shriek and lunged for the door with impossible speed. She shoved me aside with strength her slight frame shouldn't have possessed, unbolted the door, and ran out into the night. Derek and I rushed after her, stopping at the threshold. She was already at the edge of the forest, surrounded by the blue lights, which swirled around her in a frenzied dance. "Come join us," she called, but her voice was layered with countless others. "It's so beautiful here." Then the lights intensified, enveloping her completely. When they dimmed slightly, she was gone. "Inside!" Derek shouted, pulling me back. We slammed the door, bolting it securely. "What do we do?" Derek asked, his voice cracking. "We need to destroy the stone circle," I said suddenly. "It's the center of whatever this is." "How?" "We can't go out there." "We have to. It's our only chance." We gathered what weapons we could find: an axe from the woodpile, a hammer, a can of kerosene used for the outdoor lamps. "If we make it to dawn, we might have a chance," I said, checking my watch. It was 4:47 a.m. Sunrise wasn't until after 7 o'clock. We stood at the front door, gathering our courage. The knocking had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence. They were waiting for us. "Ready?" Derek asked. I nodded, though ready was the last thing I felt. He opened the door, and together we stepped out into the cold, blue-lit night, where the forest and its secrets awaited. The moment we stepped outside, the lights retreated slightly, as if surprised by our willingness to venture out. The air was unnaturally still, our footsteps crunching on the frosty ground the only sound. We had brought flashlights, but they seemed feeble compared to the ethereal blue glow that now illuminated our path. The route to the stone circle was somehow clearer than it had been in daylight. A distinct trail winding through the trees, marked by strange symbols carved into the bark. "They're leading us there," I realized aloud. As we progressed deeper into the forest, the lights began to take on more distinct shapes. What had been amorphous orbs were now vaguely humanoid, silhouettes of light with suggestions of limbs and heads. About halfway to the circle I heard it, faint at first, then growing clearer, the same music Mia had described, ethereal and haunting, a melody that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly within my mind. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Derek. The look of dread on his face told me he did. "Don't listen to it," he urged. "Focus on me, on my voice." We pressed on, each step becoming heavier as the music grew more enticing. The lights grew bolder, drawing closer, their whispers joining the melody in perfect harmony. I clutched the axe tighter, using the pain of my white-knuckled grip to anchor me to reality. "Keep moving," I told Derek, whose steps had slowed. "Don't stop." His eyes had taken on a faint blue tinge, the same change we'd seen in Mia before she ran into the forest. When we finally reached the stone circle, the scene was transformed. The stones glowed with an inner blue light, the symbols carved into them pulsating rhythmically. The central altar stone was now hovering slightly above the ground, and upon it lay the journal we'd left behind. The lights converged around the circle, dozens of them now. Within each, I could make out a face. Men, women, young, old, from different eras, all wearing the same expression of rapturous peace. "The names on the stone," Derek whispered. "They're all here." And they were, including Jason and Mia, whose lights moved forward slightly, their familiar faces visible within the blue glow. "Alex, Derek," Mia's voice called, echoed by Jason's. "Join us. Become part of the forest." "What happened to you?" I called back, my voice breaking. "A gateway," came the reply, but not from Mia or Jason. This voice was older, deeper. A light moved forward, revealing the face of Thomas Kendrick. "The stones are ancient, though we rebuilt them. They connect worlds." "What worlds?" Derek asked. "The world of flesh and the world of spirit," Thomas explained. "We exist between them now, neither fully here nor fully there. The forest claimed us, transformed us. We became its voice, its eyes, its guardians." "And the price?" Derek asked. "Your physical bodies? Your humanity? A necessary sacrifice, but not a sad one. We have transcended the limitations of flesh." "You seem trapped to me," I countered. "Confined to this forest, desperate for new recruits." "Not trapped," Thomas insisted. "We choose to remain, to guide others, to protect the gateway." "Then let us choose to leave," I said, taking a step toward the altar stone with the axe raised. The lights surged forward, but stopped short of touching us. "You don't understand," Mia's voice pleaded. "Once you've seen this reality, you can never truly return to your limited existence." "We'll take our chances," Derek said, moving to my side with the kerosene can. "You came seeking answers to the mystery. We offer them freely. But knowledge has its price." "What happened to the people who disappeared?" I asked. "Did you take them against their will?" "Some came willingly, drawn by the music. Others resisted at first, but all eventually understood. The forest calls only those who are ready." "And did they have a choice in the end? Could they have walked away?" Thomas hesitated. "Choice is complicated when one glimpses the infinite. But yes, theoretically, they could have rejected the call." "Then we reject it," I said firmly. "Let us go." The lights conferred among themselves, their whispers creating a discordant counterpoint to the music. Finally, Thomas's light returned to the forefront. "You may leave with dawn's first light," he conceded. "But the forest has touched you now, marked you, and one day, when your time in the world of flesh nears its end, you will hear the music again." I glanced at my watch, 6:42 a.m., less than 30 minutes until sunrise. "We'll wait," Derek said, keeping a firm grip on the hammer. The minutes passed with excruciating slowness. The lights maintained their distance but didn't retreat. The music continued, though at a lower volume, a constant reminder of what we were rejecting. At 7:12 a.m., the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. The lights dimmed, the music faded, and the entities retreated into the deeper shadows of the forest. "It's time," I said to Derek. "Let's go." We backed away from the stone circle, never turning our backs on it. As we reached the edge of the clearing, Thomas's voice came one last time, fainter now. "The mystery remains unsolved only to those who fear the answer." We made our way back to the cabin in silence, the morning light gradually asserting the normal world around us. Birds began to sing again. By the time we reached the cabin, it was as if the events of the night could have been a collective hallucination, if not for the empty rooms where Mia and Jason should have been. We packed quickly, leaving most of the supplies behind. We left a note for anyone who might come looking for Mia and Jason. "Call park rangers. Search the stone circle east of the cabin." Though we knew no search would find them, not in any form that could be brought back. The drive down the mountain was silent. Only as we reached the main highway did Derek finally speak. "Do you think they were telling the truth? About transcending? About the gateway?" I considered the question carefully. I don't know. Maybe they believe it's true. Or maybe it's just how the forest hunts, using our own curiosity against us. And what Thomas said about the forest marking us, that we'll hear the music again someday? I had no answer for that. The memory of that unearthly melody still lingered in the recesses of my mind, waiting perhaps for a moment of weakness to resurface. We reported Mia and Jason's disappearance to the authorities. We told a version of the truth, that they had gone hiking and never returned. We mentioned the stone circle but omitted the lights, the whispers, the music. No one would have believed us anyway. The official report eventually concluded what reports always conclude in such cases. Hikers lost in wilderness, presumed dead. The search was called off after 2 weeks. No bodies were ever found. Derek sold the cabin the following year. I've tracked its history since then, a parade of new owners, each staying less than a year before selling again. The longest anyone has remained is 8 months. The shortest, just 3 weeks. I wonder sometimes if they heard the music too, if they saw the lights moving between the trees at night, if they felt the forest watching them, waiting for them to venture into its depths. As for me, I've never returned to Blackwood Pines. But sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleeping, I hear it, the faintest echo of that otherworldly melody calling me back to the stone circle, to the friends who became part of the forest. And sometimes, I'm tempted to answer, they never found the bodies of Thomas and Sarah Kendrick, or Jason and Mia. Their disappearance remains an unsolved mystery to this day, like so many others who have vanished without a trace in America's vast wilderness. But I know the truth, or at least part of it. And now, so do you. If you're ever driving through the forests of northern Maine and come across a rustic cabin for rent at Blackwood Pines, my advice is simple. Keep driving. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some forests are better left unexplored. But if you do hear music in the trees, music like nothing you've ever heard before, well, maybe the forest is calling you too. Sweet dreams, my friends. And remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own unexplained experiences in the comments below. Do you think you would have joined the forest, or would you have resisted its call? I read every comment, and who knows, your story might inspire my next video. Until next time, sleep tight and don't let the whispers in the dark disturb your rest. Story number 2. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that something from your dream was real? That feeling where the line between what actually happened and what your mind conjured becomes so blurred that you question your own reality. I need to tell you about what's been happening to me, because I'm starting to think these aren't just dreams anymore. There's something else. Something that's bleeding into my waking life in ways I can't explain. If you've ever experienced false memories or dreams so vivid they felt like memories, you'll understand exactly what I'm going through. If not, well, consider yourself lucky, but stay with me, because what I'm about to share might help you recognize the signs if it ever happens to you. And trust me, you'll want to be prepared. Before I go any further, make sure you're somewhere comfortable but not too comfortable. You might not want to fall asleep after hearing this, and if this resonates with you or sends chills down your spine, let me know in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone in this. Now, let me tell you my story. It started about 7 months ago in the small town of Millfield, Massachusetts, where I'd moved after college to take a job at the local newspaper. Nothing fancy, just writing about community events, town council meetings, the kind of work that pays the bills while I figure out what I really want to do with my journalism degree. The town is one of those picture-perfect New England places. White church steeple piercing the sky. Town square with a gazebo where they hold summer concerts. Mom and pop shops lining Main Street. The kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked at night. At least, they used to. I found a small apartment above the hardware store, affordable if a bit cramped. The owner, Mrs. Calloway, is this sweet older lady who brings me homemade cookies every Sunday. For the new girl in town, she always says with a smile that crinkles the corners of her eyes. It was comfortable, normal, exactly what I wanted, until the dreams began. The first one hit me on a Tuesday night in September. I remember because it was the night after I covered the high school football game. The Millfield Mountaineers had won, and the whole town was buzzing with excitement. I'd filed my story, had a glass of wine, and gone to bed feeling pretty good about life. Then it happened. I dreamed I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. 3 soft taps, then silence. 3 more taps, then silence again. In the dream, I got out of bed and walked to the window, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. I remember the wooden floor, cool beneath my bare feet, the silver moonlight casting long shadows across my bedroom, and when I reached the window and pulled back the curtain, there was a face staring back at me. Not pressed against the glass, but hovering a few inches away. A woman's face, pale as milk, with dark hollows where her eyes should have been. Her mouth moved like she was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear any words. Just the continued tapping, though her hands weren't visible. I woke up gasping, sheets twisted around my legs, sweat beading on my forehead despite the autumn chill that had settled over my apartment. Just a nightmare. We all have them. I got up, splashed some water on my face, and went back to bed. By morning, it was already fading, just another bad dream to laugh off over coffee. But the next night, I had the exact same dream, with one difference. This time, when I pulled back the curtain, the woman's face was closer to the glass, and this time I could read her lips. "Let me in," she mouthed. "I know what you did." What I did? I hadn't done anything. I was new in town, for heaven's sake. I barely knew anyone. The third night, I didn't want to go to sleep at all. I stayed up late watching mindless reality TV, then scrolled through social media until my eyes burned. Finally, around 3 a.m., exhaustion won out. The dream came again. Same tapping, same walk to the window, same face. But this time, her forehead was pressed against the glass, those empty eye sockets somehow fixed on me with an intense focus. "I know what you did in the basement." Her lips formed the words clearly this time. "He's still down there." I jolted awake. A scream caught in my throat. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. My apartment didn't even have a basement. The hardware store below me did, but I'd never been down there. Or had I? For a split second, a memory flashed through my mind. The smell of damp cement. The buzz of a single fluorescent light, something heavy in my hands. But then it was gone, like a match flame extinguished by a sudden gust. I reached for my phone and checked the time. 3:17 a.m. Too early to call anyone, too late to reasonably stay awake. I turned on all the lights in my apartment and sat cross-legged on my bed until morning came, afraid to close my eyes. That's when I noticed the dirt under my fingernails, which definitely hadn't been there when I went to bed. The next day at work was a blur. My editor, Mike, asked if I was feeling okay. Apparently, I'd been staring at my computer screen for 20 minutes without typing a single word. "Just tired," I told him. "Didn't sleep well." "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, placing a cup of coffee on my desk. "Take it easy today, maybe head home early if you need to." I nodded, grateful for his concern but unable to explain what was really bothering me. How do you tell someone that you're afraid you might have done something terrible? Something you can't even remember? That afternoon I found myself standing outside the hardware store, staring at the side door that led to the basement. Mrs. Calloway was at the counter, helping a customer choose between different types of screwdrivers. She glanced up, caught my eye, and smiled. Did her smile falter a little? Was there something knowing in the way she looked at me? No, I was being paranoid. I returned to my apartment and paced the floor, trying to sort through my thoughts. The dreams felt so real, but they couldn't be memories. They just couldn't. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that woman's face at my window, or the dirt under my fingernails. I decided to do what any journalist would do: investigate. First, I checked local news reports for the past few months. No missing persons in Millfield or the surrounding area. No mysterious deaths, nothing unusual at all. Next, I casually asked Mrs. Calloway about the basement when I ran into her in the hallway. "Oh, we just use it for storage," she said, adjusting her cardigan. "Old inventory, holiday decorations, that sort of thing. Why do you ask, dear?" "Just curious," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I heard some noises the other night." Something flickered across her face. Concern? Fear? Before I could decide, it was gone, replaced by her usual warm smile. "Probably just the old furnace. This building's been standing since 1932. Bound to make some creaks and groans." That night, determined to break the cycle, I asked my coworker Diane to come over for dinner and stay late watching movies. Safety in numbers, right? We ordered pizza, opened a bottle of wine, and settled in for a horror movie marathon. In retrospect, perhaps not the best choice given my state of mind. Around midnight, Diane yawned and said she needed to head home. "You could stay over," I suggested, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "Can't. I promised to take my nephew to the aquarium tomorrow morning, but thanks for tonight, it was fun." After she left, I took 2 sleeping pills, something I never do, and crawled into bed. If the dreams came, at least I'd be too drugged to remember them. I was wrong. This time, I didn't dream about the tapping at the window. Instead, I dreamed I was in the basement of the hardware store. Concrete floor, metal shelving units filled with cardboard boxes, that single fluorescent light casting harsh shadows. In the dream, I knew exactly where to go. To the back corner, behind the old paint mixing machine that hadn't been used in years. I moved with purpose, like I'd done this before. When I reached the corner, I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edge of the concrete until I found it. A small irregularity, a place where the floor had been patched. Dream me smiled. I woke up on the floor of my apartment halfway to my door. Sleepwalking. I'd never sleepwalked before in my life. But the most terrifying part? The knees of my pajama pants were dirty, with the same distinctive reddish-brown soil that I'd seen in my dream of the basement. That morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching false memories, dream psychology, anything that might explain what was happening to me. Most of what I found wasn't helpful. Just clinical explanations of how stress or trauma can affect memory formation. But then I stumbled across a forum thread about shared dreams. People who claim to have experienced the same dream as someone else, often someone they barely knew. The thread had started years ago but had recent posts from just a few weeks back. One comment caught my eye. "Has anyone else in Millfield been having dreams about a woman with no eyes? Please contact me ASAP." The username was Millfield Insider, and the post was dated just 3 days ago. My hands shook as I created an account and sent a private message. "I've been having those dreams. Who is she? What does she want?" The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me at the Millfield Public Library, reference section, 2 p.m. today." The Millfield Public Library is one of those grand old buildings with columns out front and reading rooms with tall windows that flood the space with natural light. On any other day, I would have found it peaceful. Today, it felt oppressive, like the weight of all those books, all those stories, might come crashing down on me. I found the reference section easily enough. It was tucked away in the back, with rows of encyclopedias and reference books that probably hadn't been touched since the internet became the go-to source for information. A man sat at one of the study tables, mid-40s maybe, with graying hair at his temples and wire-rimmed glasses. He had a notebook open in front of him but wasn't writing, just waiting. When he saw me, he nodded slightly. "Millfield Insider?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Call me Robert," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You're having the dreams too." It wasn't a question. I sat down, suddenly aware of how crazy this all was. Meeting a stranger because of some shared nightmare? But I was desperate for answers. "Who is she?" I asked. "The woman in the dreams?" Robert took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Her name was Eleanor Kinsey. She lived in Millfield her entire life, taught second grade at Millfield Elementary for almost 30 years. Was? She disappeared 12 years ago, just vanished one day. Police investigated, but there were no leads, no evidence of foul play. They eventually concluded she must have left town voluntarily. "But you don't believe that," I said. He shook his head. "Eleanor would never have left without saying goodbye to her students. She loved those kids like they were her own." He paused. "I should know. I was her husband." My stomach twisted into a knot. This was real. The woman in my dreams was real. "I don't understand," I said. "Why am I dreaming about her? I never knew her. I didn't even live here when she disappeared." "You're not the only one," Robert said. "Over the years, at least 7 people have contacted me, all with the same story. Dreams about Eleanor, always asking to be let in, always saying she knows what they did." "What does it mean?" I think she's trying to tell us something. Something about what happened to her. And I think, whatever it is, it has to do with that basement." My blood ran cold. "The basement? The one under the hardware store?" Robert's eyes widened slightly. "You've seen it too, in your dreams." I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "There's something in the back corner, behind the old paint mixer. That's where Hendrix Hardware used to mix their own paints years ago," Robert said. "Before the current owners took over, Mrs. Calloway? She and her husband bought the place about 11 years ago, right after—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Right after Eleanor disappeared." "Have you ever been in that basement?" I asked. "Mrs. Calloway doesn't let anyone down there, says it's not up to code, a liability issue." Robert leaned forward. "But I think it's time someone took a look." That evening, I couldn't focus on anything. I paced my apartment, jumping at every creak and groan the old building made. Was Mrs. Calloway really involved in something sinister? The sweet lady who brought me cookies every Sunday? It seemed impossible. Around midnight, I heard movement downstairs. The hardware store had been closed for hours, but someone was definitely moving around down there. I crept to my door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. Mrs. Calloway emerged from the store entrance, locking it behind her. She was dressed in her usual cardigan and slacks. Nothing suspicious about her appearance. But as she turned to leave, I noticed something unusual. Her shoes were covered in what looked like plastic bags, secured with rubber bands around her ankles, like someone who didn't want to leave footprints. I closed my door softly and leaned against it, heart racing. This was crazy. I was letting dream logic affect how I saw reality. There had to be a rational explanation. But what if there wasn't? I picked up my phone to call Robert, then realized I didn't have his number. Our entire conversation had been through the forum messaging system. That's when the tapping started. Not from my window this time. My bedroom window faced the street, and I was 3 stories up. No, this tapping came from somewhere inside my apartment. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap, tap. I followed the sound to my bathroom. The tapping grew louder as I approached. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the mirror. With trembling fingers, I reached out and touched the cool glass surface. The tapping stopped. Then, slowly, Writing began to appear on the mirror, as if an invisible finger was tracing letters in the steam, except there was no steam. My bathroom was cold. Tonight, the letters spelled out. Basement, find me. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't sleep. I sat on my couch, all lights on, jumping at every sound, watching the hours tick by on my phone. Part of me wondered if I was losing my mind. The other part knew, with bone-deep certainty, that something was happening that defied rational explanation. At 3:17 a.m., the exact time I'd woken from my dream nights ago, I made a decision. I would go to the basement. Not because a ghostly message told me to, but because I needed answers. Needed to know if I was going crazy or if something truly sinister was happening in this quaint little town. The side door to the basement was locked, of course. But Mrs. Calloway had given me a key when I first moved in, just in case of emergencies. She'd said it worked for both the main store entrance and the side door. The key slid into the lock smoothly, and the door opened with a soft click. No alarm sounded. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and stepped into the darkness, pulling the door closed behind me. Concrete steps led down into the gloom. The smell hit me immediately. Damp earth, old paint, and something else. Something metallic and familiar that made my stomach turn. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the light switch. A single fluorescent bulb flickered to life, buzzing loudly in the silence. The basement looked exactly as it had in my dreams. Concrete floor, metal shelving units, cardboard boxes labeled with inventory items, and there, in the back corner, the old paint mixing machine. I moved toward it, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run back upstairs to the safety of my apartment. But I kept going. Behind the machine, the concrete floor looked different, newer in a small patch about 3 feet square, just as I'd seen in my dream. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edge where the new concrete met the old. There was a slight difference in texture, in color. This section had been repaired, or replaced. "What are you doing down here?" The voice made me jump to my feet. Mrs. Calloway stood at the bottom of the stairs, a bathrobe pulled tight around her thin frame, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. In her right hand, she clutched something. A hammer. I heard noises, I lied. I thought someone might be breaking in. Through the basement? Her voice was calm, but her knuckles were white around the hammer's handle. Unlikely. "I'm sorry," I said, taking a step toward the stairs. I shouldn't have come down without asking. "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have." She didn't move from her position at the foot of the stairs, blocking my exit. "Mrs. Calloway," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to Eleanor Kinsey?" The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. A tightening around the eyes, a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I think you do. I think something happened to her right here in this basement. And I think you know what it was." Mrs. Calloway's face hardened. "You've been talking to Robert Kinsey. That man has never accepted that his wife left him. He's been spinning conspiracy theories for years, trying to blame anyone but himself for her leaving." "Is that what happened?" I asked. "She just left?" "Of course that's what happened." Mrs. Calloway's voice rose sharply. "People do that, you know. They walk away from their lives, start over somewhere new. Without taking any of their belongings, without saying goodbye to the children she taught, without using her credit cards or her social security number ever again." Mrs. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're a journalist. You should know better than to traffic in rumors and speculation." I glanced back at the patch of newer concrete. "What's under there, Mrs. Calloway?" "Nothing," she said too quickly. "Old plumbing issue. We had it fixed years ago." "Before or after Eleanor disappeared?" The hammer in her hand twitched slightly. "I think you should leave now. And I think you should start looking for a new apartment. I took a step sideways, trying to maneuver around her toward the stairs. "I'll go, but people know I'm down here. Robert knows." It was a bluff. I hadn't told Robert about my plans, but I needed her to think twice before doing anything rash. Her eyes narrowed. "Robert Kinsey is a disturbed man who can't accept reality, and you're not much better breaking into my property in the middle of the night, making wild accusations." "I'm not accusing anyone," I said, taking another step toward the stairs. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening. These dreams I've been having." "Dreams?" Something shifted in her expression. "What dreams?" "About Eleanor, about this basement, about what's buried under that patch of concrete." Mrs. Calloway's face went completely blank, a mask dropping over whatever emotion might have been there a moment before. "Get out," she said, stepping aside from the stairs. "Get out, and if you know what's good for you, you'll keep your crazy ideas to yourself." I didn't need to be told twice. I hurried up the stairs, past her, and out into the night air. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door behind me. Back in my apartment, I called the police, told them everything. The dreams, the dirt under my fingernails, what I'd seen in the basement, Mrs. Calloway's reaction. The officer who took my statement sounded skeptical, but promised to look into it. I didn't expect much to come of it. What did I really have? Dreams? A patch of concrete that looked newer than the rest? A widow who got upset when a tenant broke into her basement in the middle of the night. But 2 days later, Robert called me. He'd gotten my number from the police. "They're digging up the basement," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "They found something. Ground-penetrating radar showed an anomaly." 3 days after that, the local news reported what had been found beneath the hardware store. Human remains, believed to be those of Eleanor Kinsey, missing for 12 years. Mrs. Calloway and her husband were taken in for questioning. It turned out they'd known Eleanor. Mr. Calloway had been the maintenance man at the elementary school where she taught. There had been allegations, never proven, of inappropriate behavior toward female staff. Eleanor had reportedly been gathering evidence, preparing to come forward. The Calloways had purchased the hardware store with a sudden windfall of cash shortly after Eleanor's disappearance. Cash that was never explained. As for me, the dreams stopped the night they found Eleanor's body. I'd like to say that's the end of the story, that everything went back to normal after that, but it isn't, and it didn't. Because sometimes, late at night, I still feel like someone's watching me. Not Eleanor, I think she's at peace now. No, it's something else. Some other presence that found its way to me through the breach Eleanor created. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror first thing in the morning, I catch a glimpse of someone else looking back at me. Just for a split second. Someone with my face, but not my eyes. I've moved out of Millfield now. Found a job at another small-town paper a few states away. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever started in that basement isn't finished with me yet. So I'm telling you my story, hoping that somehow putting it out into the world will give me some protection. Or at least ensure that if I disappear like Eleanor did, someone will know where to start looking. And if you've had dreams like mine, dreams that feel more like memories of things you never did, pay attention. They might be trying to tell you something important. Sleep well tonight, if you can. And maybe check under your fingernails before you go to bed. Just to be sure. If this story sent chills down your spine or maybe resonated with you in some way, let me know in the comments below. Have you ever experienced false memories or dreams so vivid they felt real? I'd love to hear your stories. And if you want more tales like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are more stories where this came from, more mysteries of the mind to explore together. Just remember, sometimes when we go looking for answers, we find questions we never thought to ask. Questions about what's real, what's memory, and what's something else entirely. Until next time, sweet dreams. Or perhaps, for your sake, no dreams at all.
Story number 3.
Have you ever felt that strange sensation of being watched? That unexplainable chill when you're completely alone, yet somehow you're not? I lived with that feeling for 6 years. 6 long years of whispers, movements in the corner of my eye, and the constant, unshakable sense that something was following me. This isn't just a ghost story, it's my life. And I'm sharing it now because I finally understood what it wanted from me. If you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain, you'll understand. And if you haven't, well, after hearing my story, you might start noticing things you've been overlooking all along. So, get comfortable, turn down the lights if you dare, and listen closely, because the most terrifying ghosts aren't the ones that scream and throw objects. They're the patient ones that wait for years until you finally understand what they're trying to tell you. The story begins now. It started during my sophomore year at Oak Ridge University in Massachusetts. I had just moved into my first off-campus apartment, a quaint second-floor unit in a converted Victorian house on Maple Street. The rent was suspiciously affordable, but as a broke college student surviving on ramen and coffee, I wasn't about to question my good fortune. My apartment had character, as realtors say when they want to distract you from the problems. Creaky hardwood floors, a slightly tilted hallway, those ornate crown moldings that collected dust in impossible-to-reach corners. But it was mine, sort of. The first unusual occurrence happened 3 weeks after I moved in. I was studying late, around 2 a.m., fighting to understand organic chemistry when I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. At first, I dismissed it as my downstairs neighbor. Mrs. Abernathy was an elderly widow who often complained about her insomnia. But something about the rhythm felt deliberate, like someone was pacing, waiting. "Hello," I called out. The footsteps stopped immediately, only to resume a few minutes later, now directly outside my bedroom door. I remember the goosebumps that spread across my arms as I stared at the doorknob. For one terrifying moment, I thought I saw it turn slightly, then nothing. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. I blamed it on exhaustion and stress. Midterms were approaching and I hadn't been sleeping well. That night, I fell asleep with my desk lamp on, just in case. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. That explanation lasted exactly 7 hours, until I returned from classes to find all my kitchen cabinet doors standing open. Every single one. My roommate Ellie was visiting her parents in Vermont for the weekend. No one else had a key. The landlord swore he hadn't been by, and the lock showed no signs of tampering. "Old houses settle," Mrs. Abernathy told me when I awkwardly asked if she'd heard anyone in my apartment. "These walls have been standing for over 100 years, dear. They like to remind us they're still here." I nodded and smiled, but her explanation didn't account for the strange, sweet smell that lingered in my apartment for days afterward, like honeysuckle and something else I couldn't quite identify. For weeks after that, small disturbances continued. Books rearranged on my shelf. A glass of water moved from the nightstand to the dresser, my laptop opening to different websites than the ones I'd left open. Each incident was minor enough that I could dismiss it, if it were isolated, but the frequency was becoming impossible to ignore. "Maybe you have a carbon monoxide leak," my friend Tyler suggested over coffee. "That stuff can make you hallucinate, forget things." Remember that Reddit post where the guy thought someone was leaving notes in his apartment? I had my landlord check. No carbon monoxide, no gas leaks. Nothing that could explain what was happening. Then came the night I couldn't dismiss. I woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m. The red digits of my alarm clock burned through the darkness as I tried to identify what had disturbed me. My room was freezing, despite the warmth of early October, my breath forming small clouds with each exhale. That's when I saw her. Or it. A faint silhouette standing in the corner of my room. the indistinct outline of a woman with long hair, just transparent enough that I could see the bookshelf behind her. She wasn't moving, just watching. I froze, unable to scream, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. 1 second passed, 2, then 10. Neither of us moved. When I finally gathered the courage to reach for the lamp, my fingers trembling uncontrollably, the figure dissipated like fog in sunlight, seeming to drift through my bedroom wall. The next morning, I found a single honeysuckle flower on my windowsill. The window was locked from the inside. That was the moment I knew with absolute certainty I wasn't alone in that apartment, and whatever was there had just made itself known. After the bedroom incident, I did what any rational 20-year-old would do. I Googled signs your house is haunted at 4 a.m. while drinking heavily caffeinated tea to stay awake until sunrise. The internet, predictably, was both helpful and terrifying. I found myself falling down rabbit holes of paranormal forums and witness accounts that ranged from scientifically minded to absolutely delusional. But one comment on an obscure ghost hunting website stuck with me. Ghosts don't follow houses, they follow people. That thought lingered with me as October faded into November. Because while the strange occurrences in my apartment continued, lights flickering, doors opening, the persistent smell of honeysuckle, I began noticing things happening elsewhere too. In the university library, books would fall from shelves near where I was studying. In my favorite coffee shop downtown, my name would be called for an order I never placed. During an evening class, my professor stopped mid-lecture and asked, "Is there someone waiting for you outside? There's a woman who keeps looking through the window." When we checked, no one was there. But the window was fogged in a perfect handprint. I started seeing her more frequently. Never fully materialized, always at a distance or in reflections. A glimpse of flowing hair in my rearview mirror. A shadow moving independently of any light source. The outline of a woman standing at the end of empty corridors, gone when I blinked. My friends noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I'd flinch at sudden movements or sounds, how I'd sometimes stop mid-conversation, distracted by something only I could see. "You need to talk to someone," Ellie insisted one evening after I'd jumped at the sound of our neighbor's door closing. "Like, professionally. This isn't healthy, Sam." But how could I explain to a therapist that I was being haunted? That I was afraid to close my eyes in the shower because I might open them to find a spectral woman staring at me through the steam? They'd prescribe antipsychotics before I could finish my sentence. Instead, I tried to establish boundaries with my unseen companion. It sounds ridiculous now, but I started talking to her, out loud in empty rooms. "I know you're there," I said to my seemingly empty bedroom one night. "I don't know what you want, but you're scaring me. Can you, knock once for yes and twice for no?" Nothing happened. Not that night, anyway. But 3 days later, as I sat in a crowded campus dining hall, my plastic fork suddenly snapped in half without me applying any pressure. Across the table, nobody else had noticed, but my water glass distinctly moved 3 inches to the left. I felt a cold breath against my ear and heard, or thought I heard, a whisper so faint it might have been imagination. Samantha. My name. She knew my name. That night, I dreamed of a woman in a white dress standing by a lake. Her back was to me, her dark hair blowing in a wind I couldn't feel. When she turned, her face was obscured by shadows, but she held out her hand. In it was a small, leather-bound book. I woke, gasping, my bedroom filled with the overwhelming scent of honeysuckle. On my desk, my journal lay open to a blank page, a pen placed perfectly beside it. Was she trying to communicate? Did she want me to write something? Or was she trying to tell me something had been written? Despite my fear, curiosity was beginning to overtake terror. This wasn't just a random haunting. She, whoever she was, wanted something specific from me. The question was, what? I decided to find out what happened in my apartment building before I moved in. The local historical society was surprisingly helpful, especially the retired librarian who volunteered there 3 days a week. The Blackwood House on Maple? Oh, that place has quite a history, Mrs. Chen said, leading me through narrow aisles of filing cabinets. Built in 1897 by Joseph Blackwood for his wife, Elizabeth. Quite the scandal at the time. He was nearly 30 years her senior. She pulled out a folder containing old photographs and newspaper clippings. One yellowed article from 1923 caught my eye. Local author's wife disappears under mysterious circumstances. The accompanying photograph showed my apartment building, looking much the same as it did now, and a stern-faced man standing beside a striking young woman with long dark hair. Elizabeth Blackwood was quite talented herself, a poet, though none of her work was published during her lifetime. She vanished one summer evening. The official story was that she ran off with a lover, but local gossip suggested something more sinister. Her body was never found. I stared at Elizabeth's face in the grainy photograph. There was something hauntingly familiar about her eyes. "Do you have any of her writings?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Mrs. Chen shook her head. Joseph claimed she never left any, but after he died, the new owners found a hidden compartment in the master bedroom with a journal. The contents were never made public. I believe the journal went to a distant relative of the Blackwoods. I thanked her and left with photocopies of everything related to the Blackwood house. That night, I examined the layout of the original house in an old blueprint. The master bedroom had been converted into what was now my bedroom. I spent hours knocking on walls, checking for loose floorboards, searching for any hidden compartment that might have been overlooked during renovations. Nothing. At 2 a.m., exhausted and discouraged, I finally gave up and collapsed onto my bed, not bothering to change out of my clothes. "I'm trying to understand," I whispered into the darkness. "If you're Elizabeth, what do you want from me?" As if in response, my laptop, which had been closed on my desk, suddenly opened. The screen illuminated, casting an eerie blue glow across my room. I watched, paralyzed, as the cursor moved on its own, opening a blank document. Text began to appear, one letter at a time, as if someone were slowly typing, "Find my words." Winter break arrived, bringing with it a difficult decision. Should I go home to my parents' house in Connecticut for 3 weeks, potentially leaving whatever was happening behind? Or stay and continue my increasingly obsessive investigation? In the end, the decision was made for me. My mother had planned a surprise family vacation to Florida, and the airplane tickets were non-refundable. I packed my bags, including all my research about Elizabeth Blackwood, and told myself that 3 weeks of sunshine would give me perspective. I was wrong. She followed me. It started small, the scent of honeysuckle in our hotel room. My mother commented on it, asking if I'd bought a new perfume. Then my personal items began moving again. My hairbrush relocating from the bathroom to my bed. My phone alarm going off at 3:17 a.m. despite being set for 8 o'clock. One morning, I woke to find the words "Find my words" written in the condensation on the bathroom mirror. When I stepped onto the hotel balcony that overlooked the ocean, I felt her presence beside me. Not threatening, but urgent. Insistent. "I'm trying," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder to make sure my parents couldn't hear me talking to myself, "but I don't know where to look." That night, I dreamed again of Elizabeth by the lake. This time, she spoke, her voice echoing as if traveling across a great distance. The words I wasn't allowed to speak in life still exist. He couldn't destroy them all. I bolted upright in bed, suddenly wide awake. He couldn't destroy them all, I repeated aloud. Of course. If Joseph Blackwood had suppressed his wife's writings, he would have destroyed her original journal. But what if there were copies? What if Elizabeth had hidden duplicates? The moment we returned to Massachusetts, I threw myself back into research. I contacted rare book dealers, literary historians, anyone who might know about unpublished works from the early 1900s. Most ignored me. Some humored what they clearly thought was a student's overenthusiastic research project. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abernathy, my downstairs neighbor, noticed me carrying a stack of photocopied articles about the Blackwood house. "You're looking into old Elizabeth, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with interest. "I wondered when you'd start asking questions. Most tenants do eventually, though you've lasted longer than most before moving out." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January air. "What do you mean? That apartment, your apartment, has had more turnover than any other unit in the building. People complain about strange occurrences, cold spots, items moving, the smell of flowers when nothing's in bloom." She tilted her head. "Sound familiar?" I nodded, unable to speak. "Elizabeth Blackwood was my grandmother's cousin," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "The family never believed she ran away. Joseph was controlling. Wouldn't let her publish her poetry, said a Blackwood woman had no business seeking public attention." My heart was racing. "Do you know what happened to her work after she disappeared?" Mrs. Abernathy smiled enigmatically. "Come inside, dear. I think it's time you and I had a proper conversation." Her apartment was cluttered with antiques and smelled of cinnamon and old books. On her mantelpiece sat a photograph I recognized, the same one I'd seen at the Historical Society, showing Joseph and Elizabeth Blackwood. "My grandmother always said Elizabeth was the true talent in that marriage," Mrs. Abernathy explained, pouring tea into delicate cups. "Joseph published several novels, but they're forgotten now. Derivative Gothic romances mostly." She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a small wooden box. Elizabeth knew her husband would destroy her work if he found it, so she made copies. Sent some to my grandmother for safekeeping. With trembling hands, she opened the box and removed a bundle of yellowed papers tied with faded blue ribbon. "I've kept them all these years, waiting for the right person to share them with." Elizabeth was brilliant. Her poetry was decades ahead of its time. Dark, passionate work about women's inner lives. The kind of thing that wasn't supposed to be discussed in polite society. She placed the bundle in my hands. "I think she's been waiting for someone to bring her words into the light. Perhaps that someone is you." That night, I read Elizabeth's poetry by lamplight while snow fell outside my window. Her words were everything Mrs. Abernathy had promised. Raw, powerful verses about desire, rage, confinement, and freedom. One poem in particular stood out, titled simply, "Aftermath. They say I vanished into air." A wife who fled her marriage bed, none thought to drag the lake for truth. None dared suspect the man who said I left of my own accord. My bones rest deep beneath the waves. My words scattered like fallen leaves. But I remain, and I observe, and wait for one who still believes. Injustice long deferred, I read the poem 3 times, my blood running cold. The lake in my dreams. The lake from her poem. They were the same. There was a small lake on the original Blackwood property. I'd seen it marked on the old property maps. Now it was part of a public park about half a mile from my apartment. The pieces were falling into place. Elizabeth hadn't run away. According to her own poem, she'd been murdered, her body disposed of in the lake. And she'd been trying to tell me, to show me all along. That night, her presence in my apartment felt different. The air was charged with anticipation. The scent of honeysuckle was stronger than ever. "I understand now," I said to the empty room. "I know what happened to you. I know what you want me to do." For the first time, she appeared fully before me. Not just a glimpse or a shadow, but a complete manifestation. Elizabeth Blackwood stood at the foot of my bed, her dark hair flowing around her pale face, her white dress untouched by time. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a surge of emotion that wasn't entirely my own. gratitude, relief, and a fierce, burning need for truth. She nodded once, solemnly, and vanished. The next morning, I took Elizabeth's poems to the local newspaper, along with all my research. The story of a century-old murder mystery and the discovery of lost literary works was too compelling to ignore. Within days, there was talk of dragging the lake. Spring came early that year. By March, the snow had melted, and the county agreed to search the lake. I stood on the shore, hugging my jacket around me despite the mild temperature, as divers disappeared beneath the dark surface. It took them less than 2 hours to find what remained of Elizabeth Blackwood, a skeleton, partially preserved in the lake's silty bottom, a gold wedding band, and, remarkably, a waterproof oilskin pouch containing what appeared to be the original journal, protected from the water all these years. The discovery made national news. Literary scholars descended on our small college town, eager to study Elizabeth's work. Forensic experts confirmed what her poetry had suggested. Her skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma. Joseph Blackwood, long dead himself, couldn't be brought to justice. But Elizabeth's story could finally be told. Her poetry was published later that year to critical acclaim, her murder solved through her own words, reaching across a century. As for me, something changed after they found her remains. The disturbances in my apartment stopped. The scent of honeysuckle faded. I no longer caught glimpses of her in reflections or felt her presence beside me. For months, I found myself missing her, strange as that might sound. After years of being haunted, the absence of my ghost left an unexpected emptiness in my life. Then, on the 1-year anniversary of the lake search, I returned to the shore at sunset. The water was calm, reflecting the pink and gold of the evening sky. I sat on a bench and opened the published collection of Elizabeth's poetry, now dog-eared from countless readings. "You're free now," I said softly. "Your words are out in the world. People know the truth." A warm breeze rustled the pages, and for a moment, just a moment, I caught the faint scent of honeysuckle. My skin tingled with goosebumps despite the pleasant temperature. I felt a light pressure on my shoulder, like the gentle touch of a hand. When I turned, no one was there, but a single honeysuckle flower lay on the bench beside me. Some might say Elizabeth Blackwood haunted me for those years. I prefer to think she chose me, trusted me, to help her find justice after a century of silence. I was never followed by a ghost. I was accompanied by one. Sometimes, even now, years later, I'll wake at exactly 3:17 a.m. for no apparent reason, or catch a hint of honeysuckle when no flowers are blooming. Little reminders that the barrier between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. If you're listening to this and feeling a chill, maybe check your surroundings. That movement in the corner of your eye, that unexplained sound. Perhaps someone is trying to tell you something, trying to be heard. The question is, are you brave enough to listen? Because ghosts don't always want to scare us. Sometimes they just want justice. Sometimes they just want their stories told. And sometimes they choose the most unlikely people to help them. Sleep well tonight. And if you feel a presence watching over you, don't be afraid, at least not right away. First, ask yourself, what might they be trying to tell you? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own unexplained experiences in the comments below. Have you ever felt a presence you couldn't explain? Found items moved mysteriously? Smelled something that shouldn't be there? Share your stories, subscribe for more true tales of the unexplained, and remember, sometimes the most important messages come from beyond the world we can see. Sweet dreams. And don't forget to listen to the whispers in the dark. Listen. The whispers, and make a decision whether we are going to cooperate with the whispers or we just want to skip them. But actually, no one can skip these whispers. If you walk away from them, they will run towards you. until they reach you. They confront you, make you pay, make you suffer the same thing they suffer. There is no escape from them. If you want to escape, help them, so they can have peace, and you also can have it. Help, or you will ask for help soon. So, the end of today's video has arrived. Share your personal horror experiences in the comments. Also, comment the part of the story that you find the most horror and terrifying. If you like this video, leave a like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, ring the bell icon so you don't miss the upcoming videos. Remember, don't run from whispers, because they follow you. They know you. They want you to listen, just confront them. Now, sleep well, or should I say, have a haunted night. Story number 4. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed to enter your life for a purpose, only to disappear without a trace? Someone who left such an impression that years later, you still find yourself wondering if they were even real. Tonight, I'm going to share a story that's haunted me for over 15 years. A story about a stranger who appeared in my life during a particularly vulnerable time and then simply vanished. Before I begin, make sure you're comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a bit. This story is perfect for those nights when you're tucked in bed, ready to drift off to a different reality. Though I can't promise your dreams will be peaceful. If you enjoy this kind of tale, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories that linger in that space between reality and nightmare. Leave a comment below sharing if you've ever encountered someone who seemed not quite right. Someone who appeared and disappeared under circumstances that still make you question your own memories. And now, the story begins. I've lived in the small town of Millfield, Massachusetts my entire life. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, where the same families have occupied the same houses for generations. When you grow up in a town like this, you develop an instinct, a sixth sense for recognizing outsiders. That's why David Parker stood out the moment he arrived. Though that wasn't the only reason. It was October 2007. The autumn that year was particularly beautiful, with the maple trees lining Main Street displaying their fiery colors against skies so blue they almost hurt to look at. Those were difficult days for me. I had just lost my father to cancer, and the family hardware store he'd run for 30 years had become my responsibility overnight. At 28, I wasn't prepared for either loss, my father or my freedom. The bell above the shop door jingled as he entered, bringing with him the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. "Morning," he said, his voice soft as he removed his gloves. I remember thinking his hands looked too smooth for a man his age, like they'd never seen a day of hard work. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, straightening items on the counter that didn't need straightening. "Just browsing for now." He smiled. His teeth were perfect, too perfect. "I'm new in town. Thought I'd get to know the local establishments." "Welcome to Millfield Hardware." I extended my hand. "I'm Thomas Riley." His grip was cool and dry. David Parker. There was something in the way he held my gaze a beat too long that made me uneasy. Not threatening, exactly. Just strange, like he was memorizing my face for later reference. "You've taken over from your father, I understand," he said, examining a display of hammers. "My condolences." I frowned. "How did you—" "Small town," he shrugged. "News travels." That made sense, of course, but I couldn't recall mentioning my father to anyone that morning. And David had only just arrived, or so he claimed. "What brings you to Millfield?" I asked, watching as he tested the weight of various tools in his palm. "Research." He set down a wrench with precision, aligning it perfectly with the others. "I'm working on a book about small-town America and how these communities preserve their identities in the modern age." Sounds interesting. It didn't, really, but something made me want to keep him talking. "It is." His eyes caught the light in a peculiar way, reflecting it rather than absorbing it. Every town has its secrets. Its stories that don't make it into the official history. Those are the ones I'm after. The bell jingled again as Mrs. Hoffman entered, arms laden with shopping bags from the grocery store across the street. David stepped aside, but not before leaning closer to whisper, "Perhaps you could share some of Millfield's stories with me over dinner tonight." Before I could respond, he slipped me a business card. The Millfield Inn, room 212, 7 o'clock. Then he was gone, nodding politely to Mrs. Hoffman as he left. I should have thrown the card away. Something about David Parker made my skin prickle with unease. But grief does strange things to your judgment. It leaves you vulnerable in ways you don't recognize until later. And the truth was, I was lonely. The weight of my father's absence and the responsibility of the store had isolated me from my friends. The prospect of conversation with someone who knew nothing about my pain was appealing. So, at 7 o'clock, I found myself knocking on the door of room 212 at the Millfield Inn. A decision I would question for years to come. The door opened immediately, as if he'd been standing just on the other side waiting. David had transformed the small hotel room into something else entirely. Candles flickered on every surface, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The standard hotel furniture had been pushed aside to make room for a small dining table, set with china that certainly didn't belong to the inn. "Thomas," he smiled that perfect smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I hesitated at the threshold. I almost didn't. But curiosity got the better of you. He gestured for me to enter. It usually does. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded oddly final. I remember thinking even then that I could simply turn around and leave, but I didn't. I sat down at that carefully arranged table and accepted a glass of deep red wine that tasted like nothing I'd ever had before. "Tell me about your father," David said, his eyes reflecting the candlelight in that strange, mirror-like way. And I did. I told him things I hadn't told anyone else, about the way my father looked in his final days, so different from the strong man who had taught me to build and fix things with my hands, about the promises I'd made at his bedside, about my fear that I would never measure up to the legacy he'd left behind. David listened with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. He barely touched his food, but kept refilling my wine glass until the room began to tilt pleasantly around me. "You carry a heavy burden," he said finally, "the weight of a man who is missed." "Everyone in town misses him," I replied. David leaned forward, the candlelight throwing his face into sharp relief. "But not everyone can bring him back." My glass froze halfway to my lips. "What?" "Memory is a powerful thing, Thomas." His voice had changed, becoming deeper, more resonant. Especially shared memory. The more people who remember a person, the more substantial those memories become. I set my glass down carefully. "I think I should go." "Of course." He didn't try to stop me, which somehow made it worse. At the door, he caught my arm gently. "Just one question before you leave. Do you keep any of your father's personal items at the store?" The question seemed odd, but harmless enough. "His old toolbox is still under the counter." I couldn't bear to move it. Something flickered across David's face, satisfaction, perhaps. "Interesting. Thank you for a lovely evening, Thomas. I do hope we'll speak again soon." As I walked home through the quiet streets of Millfield, the cool October air clearing my head, I tried to make sense of our conversation. There had been something unsettling about the entire encounter, yet I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had disturbed me so much. By the time I reached my apartment above the hardware store, I had convinced myself that David Parker was simply an eccentric writer with poor social skills. But that night I dreamed of my father, standing behind the counter of the store, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he fixed a customer's broken lamp. In the dream, I called out to him, but he couldn't hear me, and standing in the corner, watching him with those reflective eyes, was David Parker. I woke in a cold sweat, the dream clinging to me like cobwebs. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through my curtains, and with it came the certainty that something was wrong at the store. Call it intuition or paranoia, but I pulled on my clothes with shaking hands and rushed downstairs. The front door was locked, just as I'd left it. Everything looked normal, except for my father's toolbox, which sat open on the counter rather than in its place below it. As I approached, I noticed something else. A smell in the air, familiar and impossible. My father's aftershave, the one my mother had given him every Christmas for 30 years. The bottle I'd buried with him because I couldn't bear to throw it away. And there, on top of the neatly arranged tools, lay a business card. David Parker's card. But the room number had changed from 212 to 213. I called the Millfield Inn immediately, my fingers trembling as I dialed. The morning clerk sounded bored when she answered. "I need to speak with one of your guests," I said without preamble. "David Parker, room 212, or possibly 213. There was the sound of computer keys clicking. "I'm sorry, sir, we don't have anyone by that name registered with us." "That's impossible. I was just there last night. Room 212. Room 212 has been vacant for 3 days, sir, and room 213 is under renovation. No one could have been staying in either room." I thanked her automatically and hung up. My eyes fell on the business card again. The room number definitely read 213 now, though I was certain it had been 212 the day before. I flipped it over. On the back, in elegant handwriting that I somehow knew belonged to David, was a message. "Memory is the architecture of identity. I'll be at the cemetery at noon." I should have called the police. A stranger had somehow entered my store in the middle of the night, touched my father's belongings, and left me a cryptic message. Instead, I found myself driving to Millfield Cemetery as the church bells struck 12, drawn by a curiosity that overrode my fear. The cemetery was empty when I arrived, the late October sun casting long shadows across the granite headstones. I made my way to my father's grave, half expecting to find David waiting there. Instead, I found fresh flowers, lilies, my father's favorite, and another business card propped against them. The room number had changed again. 214. On the back, "Your father was well liked, so many memories to work with, come tonight, 8 p.m. I stood there for a long time, the card growing damp in my clenched fist. Something was very wrong. David Parker was playing some kind of game with me, and my grief had made me an easy target. Yet beneath my anger and fear was a current of hope. His words about memory, about bringing people back, they had touched something desperate in me. That afternoon I did what I should have done immediately. I started asking questions. No one in town seemed to know much about David Parker. The bookstore owner remembered selling him a history of Millfield, but couldn't recall his face. The barista at the coffee shop thought he might have served him, but wasn't sure. It was as if David moved through the world, leaving only the faintest impression on people's memories, except mine. In my memory, his face was crystal clear. Those reflective eyes, that too-perfect smile. By evening, I had convinced myself not to go to the inn. Whatever David was doing, I wanted no part of it. I closed the store early and retreated to my apartment, double-checking every lock. But as 8 o'clock approached, I found myself staring at the business card, running my thumb over the embossed number 214. The phone rang, startling me. I answered without thinking. Thomas, my father's voice, exactly as I remembered it. "Son, I need your help with something at the store." The phone slipped from my numb fingers. I knew that voice. I had grown up with that voice. It was impossible. And yet, I ran downstairs to the store, heart pounding. The lights were on, though I had turned them off. And there, behind the counter, stood my father. or something wearing his shape. He looked solid, real, his gray hair, the reading glasses perched on his nose, the flannel shirt he'd worn almost every day. "There you are," he said, looking up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can you help me find the inventory list? I can't seem to remember where I put it." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because standing in the corner, watching with those reflective eyes, was David Parker. "Remarkable, isn't it?" David said softly. "The power of collective memory. Your father was known by so many, remembered by so many. It makes the transition much easier." "What have you done?" I whispered. "I've given you what you wanted." David gestured to the figure of my father, who was now frowning at a stack of papers. "A second chance." The thing that looked like my father turned toward me, its movements slightly too fluid, too perfect. "Tommy, are you feeling all right? You look pale." It was his voice, his face. But something was wrong. The eyes, they reflected the light the same way David's did. "This isn't real," I said, backing away. "Whatever you've done, undo it. This isn't my father." David sighed, as if disappointed by a student who had failed to grasp a simple concept. "Of course it is. Everything that made your father who he was exists in memory, yours. The town's. I've simply consolidated those memories into a more tangible form." Now, the thing that wore my father's face smiled apologetically. "I know it's a lot to take in, son, but I'm here now. Isn't that what matters?" I fled. Out into the night, running blindly through the streets of Millfield until I found myself at the cemetery, standing before my father's grave, gasping for breath. The headstone was still there, the ground undisturbed. Whatever was in my store, it hadn't come from here. When I finally gathered the courage to return, the store was dark and empty. No sign of my father, or the thing that had worn his face. No sign of David Parker, only another business card on the counter, the number now changed to 215. On the back, "Memory can create. Memory can also destroy. Choose carefully." The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and increasingly desperate attempts to find David Parker. I searched every hotel and bed and breakfast in town. I showed his business card to everyone I met. I even considered hiring a private investigator, but something told me that conventional methods wouldn't work with David. He wasn't a conventional man, if he was a man at all. Meanwhile, strange things continued to happen at the store. Tools would move overnight. The scent of my father's aftershave would appear suddenly, then vanish. Customers would mention having seen my father around town, looking well, asking after old friends, and each morning I would find a new business card, the room number increasing by 1, with a new message on the back. Always about memory, always vaguely threatening. 216. Memory is selective, we remember what serves us. 217. What if you could choose which memories remain? 218. Some memories are parasites, they feed on the host. 219. Your father's memories live in you, but what else lives there? By the time I found the card with 220 on it, I was barely sleeping. The message read, "Tonight, 9 p.m. Your father's favorite fishing spot. Come alone." Green Lake had been my father's sanctuary. Every Sunday, rain or shine, he would take his fishing gear and spend the day by the water. As children, my brother and I would sometimes accompany him, learning the patience that fishing requires. After my brother moved to California and I took on more responsibility at the store, it became his solitary ritual. I arrived at the lake just as the sun was setting, casting long fingers of gold and crimson across the still water. David was already there, standing at the end of the small wooden pier where my father used to fish. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said without turning. "I want answers." My voice sounded stronger than I felt. "What are you? What do you want from me?" David turned slowly, his eyes catching the last light of day, reflecting it like twin mirrors. I am a collector, Thomas, a curator of sorts. Of what? Memories? He smiled, pleased. Precisely. I travel from town to town seeking those whose memories are potent. Grief makes memories exceptionally powerful, you see, especially shared grief, like what this town feels for your father. So you, what? Feed on them. Such a crude word, David sighed. I preserve them, give them form. Memory is the only true immortality, Thomas. When the last person who remembers you dies, that's when you truly cease to exist. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. And my father? That thing in the store? A construct, formed from the collective memories this town holds of Edward Riley. Not complete, of course. Memory is imperfect, fragmentary, but substantial enough. I took a step closer, anger overriding my fear. Why? Why him? Why me? David's expression softened into something like pity. Because you called to me, Thomas. Your grief was a beacon, so pure, so consuming. And your father, a man known and loved by an entire town. Do you know how rare that is these days? Most people live and die, leaving only the faintest impressions. I want you to leave. My hands were shaking. Take whatever you've created and go. It's not that simple. David gestured to the darkening water. The construct exists now. It will continue to exist as long as the memories that form it remain strong. Unless what? His eyes met mine, reflecting nothing now in the gathering darkness. Unless you let him go, Thomas. Truly let him go. Not just your father's physical presence, but the grief that keeps him so vivid in your mind. I laughed bitterly. That's your solution? Just stop grieving? No. David shook his head slowly. My solution is to take your grief with me when I leave. To extract it, like poison from a wound. But there's a cost. There always is, I said. The memories would go too. Not all of them. You would still know you had a father, still remember facts about him. But the emotional weight, the sensory details, the sound of his voice, those would fade to whispers. I stared at him, horror dawning. You want me to forget him. I want to free you. David stepped closer, his voice gentle. Grief, like yours, is a prison, Thomas. I'm offering you the key. By erasing my father, by allowing him to truly rest. The construct is not at peace, Thomas. It exists in a state of perpetual confusion, caught between memory and nothingness. Is that what you want for him? I thought of the thing I had seen in the store, so like my father and yet so wrong. The thought of it continuing to exist, to interact with the town, to pretend to be him. It was unbearable. If I agree, I said slowly, you'll leave town? Take that thing with you? David nodded. You won't see either of us again. And the town, will everyone forget him? No. Their memories will remain intact. Only yours will be altered. You'll be able to run the store without his ghost looking over your shoulder. You'll be free. Freedom. It was a seductive offer. The weight of grief had been crushing me for months. The thought of relief, even at such a cost, was tempting. I need time, I said finally. David reached into his pocket and handed me a business card. The number was 221. Tomorrow night, same time, same place. Your answer then. I took the card, and when I looked up, David was gone. As if he had simply stepped into the darkness and become part of it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my father's old armchair in the apartment above the store, surrounded by photographs and mementos of his life. Each one held memories. Fishing trips, baseball games, quiet evenings spent learning how to repair broken things. Could I give those up? Should I? Near dawn, exhausted and no closer to a decision, I dozed off in the chair. I dreamed of my father again, but this time he was sitting across from me, his eyes normal, kind. "It's not about remembering or forgetting, Tommy," he said in the dream. "It's about honoring who I was by being who you are." I woke with tears on my face and a certainty in my heart. David Parker might have the power to alter memories, to create constructs from collective grief, but he didn't understand the purpose of remembering. It wasn't just about holding on to the past, it was about carrying it forward into the future. That evening, I returned to Green Lake with my answer. David was waiting at the end of the pier again, his silhouette dark against the twilight sky. He turned as I approached, his eyes searching my face. "You've decided," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." I stood tall, the weight of my decision making me stronger rather than heavier. "I'm keeping my memories, all of them. The pain, the grief, the joy, they're mine." A strange expression crossed David's face, surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. "You would choose to remain in pain." "I choose to remain whole," I corrected him. "My father shaped who I am. Forgetting him, even parts of him, would be forgetting myself." David was silent for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. "The construct will remain, then. Walking the town, interacting with people who knew your father. A constant reminder of what you've lost." "No." I shook my head firmly. "You created it. You can uncreate it. That's my condition. You leave, and you take that thing with you, but my memories stay intact." "You presume to negotiate with me." There was a dangerous edge to his voice now. "You have no idea what I am capable of, Thomas." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but I know what I'm capable of. I can warn the town, show them what you've done. Memory works both ways, doesn't it? If people stop believing in the construct, if they remember my father as he was, not as that pale imitation, it weakens." It was a guess, but from the flicker of unease in David's expression, I knew I had hit upon something true. "You would expose me?" he asked softly. "If necessary." I met his gaze steadily. "But I'd rather we simply part ways. You find someone else's grief to feed on, far from Millfield." David stepped closer, and for a moment I thought he might attack me. Instead, he reached out and placed his cool, dry hand against my cheek. "You're stronger than I anticipated. Most people choose forgetting over pain." "I'm not most people," I said, "and this isn't a choice between forgetting and pain. It's a choice between honoring my father's memory and betraying it." David's hand fell away. "Very well, the construct will be gone by morning, as will I." "Thank you," I said, surprised by his acquiescence. He smiled that perfect smile one last time. "Don't thank me yet. Grief changes over time, Thomas. It transforms, evolves. Years from now, you may wish you had taken my offer. I'll take my chances." David nodded, then reached into his pocket and handed me one final business card. The number was 222. "If you change your mind." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, his figure fading into the darkness far too quickly to be natural. I stood on the pier for a long time afterward, the card clutched in my hand, wondering if I had made the right choice. The next morning, I woke to find the store exactly as it should be. My father's toolbox was back in its place under the counter. The smell of his aftershave was gone. There was no sign that David Parker or the construct had ever existed, except for the business card with 222 on it, which I kept in my wallet as a reminder. Not of David, but of the choice I had made to honor my father by remembering him, pain and all. Over the years, I asked subtle questions around town about David Parker. No one remembered him. It was as if he had vanished, not just from Millfield, but from everyone's memory except mine. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the grief resurfaces, because it does, even 15 years later, I take out that card and wonder, was David Parker even real? Or was he something my grief-stricken mind created to help me process my loss? I'll never know for certain, but I do know this. The stranger who vanished from my life left me with a gift, though not the one he intended. He helped me understand that memory, even painful memory, is precious. It connects us to those we've lost in ways that transcend physical presence. So if you're listening to this story in the dark, perhaps grieving someone of your own, remember, the pain you feel is the echo of love. Don't run from it. Don't try to forget. Let it change you, strengthen you, guide you forward. As for David Parker, sometimes I think I catch glimpses of him in crowds. A flash of those reflective eyes, that too perfect smile. But he never approaches me, and I never approach him. We made our bargain, and so far we've both kept our ends of it, but I still keep his card with me, just in case. Did this story resonate with you? Have you ever encountered someone who seemed to appear in your life for a specific purpose, only to vanish without explanation? Or perhaps you've experienced grief that seemed to take physical form. Share your stories in the comments below. Subscribe if you want to hear more tales that linger in that space between memory and imagination, between comfort and fear. And remember, sometimes the strangers who vanish from our lives leave the deepest impressions. Now, sleep. Or at least, try to. It's quiet now, too quiet, but not empty. That feeling crawling up your spine, that weight pressing on your chest, that's not your imagination. You're not alone. There's something behind the curtain. You haven't looked, not because you forgot, but because you're afraid to know. You heard the whisper, software wet, wrong. Like breath dragged across broken glass. But you told yourself it was the wind, didn't you? That lie made you feel safe. Temporarily. Let me ask you, does the wind whisper your name? Does the wind tap lightly, again and again, from the same spot, behind the curtain, every night? Does the wind leave scratches on your window that weren't there this morning? Thin, sharp, like claws, like warnings. You don't remember opening the window. You never open the window. But it's unlocked now. You could check, you could stand up, you could walk over, and pull the curtain back. But you won't, because you know. You know what's waiting, not because you've seen it, but because you felt it. In the quiet, in the dark. Every time you close your eyes, every time you wake up and your blanket is just slightly moved. Your door slightly cracked. You try to explain it. Your mind wants to explain it. But that whisper, that sound that only comes when you're alone, when everything is still, when the night is at its deepest, that's not a dream, that's a presence. It doesn't want your fear, it wants your attention. It feeds on the moment you doubt yourself. The second you wonder if you heard something, the instant your heart rate rises. That's when it leans closer. It's been patient, watching, learning you like prey. You ever notice it never shows up when the lights are on, when someone's in the room? It waits for the ritual. The brushing of your teeth, the turning off of lights, the last look at your phone, the deep breath just before sleep. That's when it wakes up. That's when it stirs behind the curtain. Sometimes it watches you all night. Sometimes it moves. A shift in the shadow. A faint creak on the floorboards. The sound of fabric sliding over skin. And when you don't check, when you ignore it, that's when it comes closer. Not fast, not loud, just closer. You might feel a cold spot on the bed. You might feel breath on your neck. You might hear a whisper in your ear that sounds almost like your voice. It copies, it mimics, it blends, not to confuse you, to prepare you, because soon it won't need the curtain, it won't need shadows, it will sit beside you, stand behind you, speak through you. You won't even know when it happens. You'll wake up, look in the mirror, and something will be off. Your eyes won't blink quite right, your smile will linger too long. Your reflection will move just a little after you do. And the people around you? They'll say you seem different, not worse, just not you. But tonight you're still you, still in control, for now. You could still check. You could still confront it. Pull the curtain back, face it, but deep down, you've already made your choice. You won't. Because you'd rather lie still, let your eyes drift shut, and hope sleep comes quickly. And it will. But what you wake up as might not be the same. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something bigger. Something that watches with you, that sits beside you as you watch, as you listen, as you wait. Because this story doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It follows you into the next room, into your dreams, into your reflection. If you liked this story, like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, so we don't miss you, and comment below. Tell us the moment you stopped feeling alone. We're watching, we're listening, and we read everything. Now, go ahead, gain the courage to check the dark corners before you sleep. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, sleep well, if you can.